future NBA star, or just another criminal? The cop decided the guy was guilty just because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Find out how this story ended and what changed everything overnight. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and post in the comments where you're watching this video from. The evening sun cast a warm, golden light over the dilapidated streets of Michael Carter's neighborhood, but the beauty of the sunset was a stark contrast to the reality of life in the impoverished area. The houses were old, some falling apart, with cracked windows and graffiti-covered walls. The streets were littered with trash, and crime was as common as the pigeons that flocked to the local park. This was home for Michael, his mother, and his siblings. Despite the harshness of their surroundings, this neighborhood was where he had built his dreams of escaping to a better future. Michael's father had left them when he was only 8 years old. He was too young to understand the complexities of why his father chose to abandon their family. But the memory of his mother crying herself to sleep every night after his departure was still fresh in his mind. His father's departure left an emotional and financial void that Michael and his family would struggle to fill for years. Now, at 19, Michael had grown into a tall, strong young man with broad shoulders and a determination that shone in his eyes. He had inherited his father's height and athleticism, but none of his father's cowardice. His mother, Mrs. Carter, was the cornerstone of the family. After his father left, she took on every job she could find just to keep the family afloat. Her hands, once soft and delicate, were now calloused from working long hours cleaning offices and homes, taking shifts at the local diner, and even selling homemade meals to construction workers in the neighborhood. She had grown tired and worn, but her spirit remained unbreakable. She never complained, even though it was clear to everyone in the family that the weight of supporting them had taken its toll. Michael admired his mother more than anyone else in the world. She never allowed her children to see how exhausted she was, nor did she ever speak of the dreams she had sacrificed to give them a chance at life. Yet, Michael knew. He could see it in the way she would sigh when she thought no one was looking, in the way she held her back after standing for hours cooking or cleaning. It was for her that he worked so hard, why he gave everything to his one true passion: basketball. Basketball wasn't just a hobby for Michael. It was his salvation. The cracked concrete court a few blocks from his house was where he spent most of his free time. It was there, under the faded hoops with their rusted rims, that he honed his skills, dreaming of the day when he would play in the NBA and change his family's fortune forever. The basketball court became his sanctuary, the one place where he could forget the noise of the streets, the gang violence, and the poverty that seemed to define his life. From a young age, Michael was drawn to the game. He had watched games with his father before he left, mesmerized by the way the players soared through the air, making seemingly impossible shots with ease. His favorite player was LeBron James, a legend who had overcome adversity and risen to the top of the sport. Michael wanted to be like him, not just for the fame or the fortune, but for the chance to lift his family out of their difficult circumstances. He wasn't alone in the struggle. His younger brother Jordan, named after the basketball great, had also shown promise on the court, though his passion didn't burn as brightly as Michael's. His 2 younger sisters, Layla and Destiny, were still in middle school, and though they were too young to fully understand the weight of the family's situation, they knew that their older brother's success could mean a better life for them all. But no matter how much Michael focused on his future, the present was always there, reminding him of how far he had to go. The neighborhood where they lived was rough. Violence was a part of daily life, and the sound of gunshots in the night was something Michael and his family had become accustomed to. Drugs were sold openly on the street corners, and gangs ruled the blocks with intimidation and fear. The police were a constant presence, but they were not there to protect the people who lived in the neighborhood. Instead, they treated everyone, especially the young black men like Michael, with suspicion and hostility. Growing up, Michael had seen his friends harassed by the police for doing nothing more than walking down the street. He had heard stories of kids being roughed up, arrested, or worse, simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And though he had tried to stay out of trouble, to keep his head down and focus on his game, he knew that the color of his skin made him a target. His mother, though strong, was also wary of the police. She had taught him from a young age to be careful, to never give the police any reason to suspect him of wrongdoing. "Keep your hands where they can see them," she would say. "Speak clearly, and don't give them attitude. Always be respectful, even if they're not respectful to you." These were the lessons she had drilled into him, lessons that were meant to keep him safe, though they also reminded him of the reality he lived in, that no matter how good he was at basketball, to the police, he was just another black kid from the projects. The Carter family's financial situation was always precarious. Despite working multiple jobs, Mrs. Carter could barely keep up with the rent, bills, and the cost of raising 4 children. There were many nights when Michael went to bed hungry, pretending that he wasn't so his younger siblings could have a little extra food. The fridge was often empty, and what little food they had was carefully rationed. Michael's part-time job at a local convenience store helped a little, but it was nowhere near enough to make a real difference. His real hope lay in basketball. If he could make it to the NBA, not only would he be able to provide for his family, but he could finally give his mother the life she deserved, a life where she didn't have to work herself to exhaustion every day. He imagined buying her a house, far away from the violence and poverty they were trapped in now. A house where his siblings could grow up without fear, where they could play in the yard without the threat of gunshots or gang members lurking around the corner. It was this vision that pushed Michael to train harder than anyone else, to spend every free moment on the court, perfecting his shot, working on his footwork, and studying the game. Michael's routine was grueling. He would wake up early, go to school, attend basketball practice, and then head to the local court for extra training long after his teammates had gone home. He practiced in the rain, in the cold, and sometimes even in the dark when the streetlights flickered out. His hands were often raw from gripping the ball, and his legs ached from hours of running drills. But he never complained. He knew that every hour he put in now was an investment in his future. His friends often teased him for being so serious about basketball. They would invite him to parties or ask him to hang out after school, but Michael always turned them down. He had no time for distractions. His dream was too important to risk it all for a night of fun. His dedication sometimes isolated him from his peers, but Michael didn't mind. He wasn't interested in being popular or making friends. He was focused on one thing: becoming the best basketball player he could be. As the oldest child, Michael felt a deep sense of responsibility for his family. His siblings looked up to him, especially Jordan, who admired his older brother's talent and work ethic. Michael knew that he had to set an example, not just for Jordan, but for Layla and Destiny as well. He wanted them to see that hard work could lead to success, even if the odds were stacked against them. But the weight of that responsibility was heavy. There were nights when Michael lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling of their small apartment, wondering if he was doing enough. He worried about his mother's health, about the bills piling up on the kitchen table, and about what would happen if he didn't make it to the NBA. Failure wasn't an option, not when so many people were counting on him. This pressure drove him to push himself harder, to train longer, and to ignore the pain that often came with his intense regimen. Michael's future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He would do whatever it took to achieve his dream, not just for himself, but for his family, the people who had sacrificed everything for him, and who depended on him to bring them out of the darkness. As Michael's talent on the court grew, so did his reputation. He was becoming a rising star in the university basketball scene, and the dream of playing in the NBA no longer seemed so far away. But with success came new challenges, and soon Michael would learn that the world wasn't ready to let him rise so easily. Michael's life revolved around a strict routine. He rose before the sun, his alarm clock blaring through the dim, quiet apartment. His siblings were still asleep, curled up in the modest living room that doubled as a sleeping area. The apartment, though small and cramped, was filled with the sounds of early morning life, the creaking of old floorboards, the faint hum of traffic from the streets below, and the smell of his mother's brewing coffee as she prepared for yet another long day at work. Michael's day, however, would be even longer. His morning workouts had become legendary among his peers, who knew of his single-minded dedication. Michael would jog to the community basketball court, his breath visible in the cool dawn air, while most of the neighborhood was still sleeping. The court was old, its cracked pavement covered in graffiti and litter. The backboards were chipped, and the metal rims had long since rusted, but none of that mattered to Michael. This was where he honed his craft, day in and day out, pushing his body to its limits in pursuit of perfection. Basketball was his way out. It was more than just a game. It was his lifeline, a ticket to a better life for him and his family. The relentless grind, the early morning sprints, the countless jump shots, all of it was building toward one goal, making it to the NBA. The dreams of becoming a professional basketball player weren't just fantasies. They were survival instincts, forged in a world that offered him little else. His talent was undeniable, but talent alone wasn't enough in a place like this. Michael knew that only through hard work and sheer willpower could he rise above the challenges he faced. As Michael's skills improved, so did his standing in the university basketball scene. He had earned a spot on his college's team through a scholarship, a rare opportunity for someone from his background. His natural athleticism, combined with a fierce work ethic, caught the attention of coaches and scouts alike. But more than anything, it was his focus and drive that set him apart. On the court, Michael was a machine, calculating, determined, and relentless. His every move was precise, every play executed with the single-minded intention of getting better. The other players respected him, even if they didn't always understand him. While many of them treated basketball as a stepping stone or a pastime, Michael saw it as his only path forward. He didn't go to parties after games, didn't hang out with his teammates at the local bar, and didn't waste time on distractions. Every spare moment was spent in the gym or on the court, training alone until the lights were shut off and he was forced to leave. It wasn't long before word of his skill spread beyond the university. Clips of his highlight reel dunks and lightning-quick footwork began circulating on social media. His games started attracting bigger crowds, and soon basketball forums and blogs were buzzing about that kid from the projects who might just be the next big thing. The nickname, the Project Prodigy, began to stick, and scouts from various NBA teams started to take notice. But with success came its own set of challenges. The pressure was mounting, both on and off the court. For every game he played, for every shot he made, there was the looming weight of expectation. He wasn't just playing for himself anymore. He was playing for his family, for the people in his neighborhood who believed in him, and for those who hoped he would be the one to escape the cycle of poverty and violence. Every missed shot felt like a failure, not just to himself, but to all the people depending on him to succeed. His family, though proud of his accomplishments, rarely got to see him. His mother worked double shifts to keep the lights on, and Michael's intense schedule meant that he was often gone before she woke up and came home long after she had already gone to bed. His siblings, especially Jordan, missed having him around. There was a time when Michael and Jordan would play basketball together on the weekends, but now those moments were rare. Yet Michael didn't complain. He knew what was at stake. Every hour he spent training was another step toward his goal, another step toward getting his family out of the neighborhood that had claimed so many lives around them. He remembered too well the friends he had lost to violence, drugs, and incarceration. His success wasn't just for him. It was for all of them, the ones who didn't make it out. Despite his rise in the basketball world, Michael couldn't escape the shadow of racism that followed him wherever he went. On the court, his talent spoke for itself, but off the court, he and his teammates were often seen through a different lens. His college team was predominantly made up of black players, and though they were one of the best in the league, they faced constant scrutiny and disrespect. At away games, especially in predominantly white towns, they were greeted with hostility. Racist slurs were hurled from the stands, and referees often made questionable calls against them. Michael had lost count of how many times he had heard fans scream, "Go back to the hood," or worse. The treatment they received wasn't subtle. It was overt, unapologetic, and relentless. One particularly painful incident occurred after a game in which Michael had led his team to a blowout victory. As he and his teammates were leaving the gym, a group of students from the opposing team's school surrounded them in the parking lot, taunting them with racial slurs and insults. "You'll never make it to the NBA," one of them sneered. "You think you're special just 'cause you can play ball. You'll always be just another thug." Michael kept his head down, urging his teammates to do the same. He had learned early on that engaging with people like that would only lead to trouble. But the words stung. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he achieved, there were always people who would see him as nothing more than the color of his skin. Racism wasn't confined to the basketball courts or the opposing fans. Michael and his friends had long been accustomed to being targeted by the police, especially in their neighborhood. It didn't matter if they were innocent. To the cops, young black men were always suspects. One night after practice, as Michael and a few of his teammates were walking back to their dorms, they were stopped by a pair of police officers who demanded to know what they were doing out so late. The officers, both white, seemed on edge, as though expecting trouble. Their hands rested on their holsters as they questioned the group. "We just finished practice, officers," Michael explained calmly. "We're heading back to campus." One of the officers sneered. "This late? You sure you're not causing trouble? There's been a lot of break-ins around here lately." Michael clenched his fists, but forced himself to stay calm. "We're basketball players," he said. "We're just trying to get back to the dorms." The officers didn't seem convinced. They made the group stand against the wall while they checked their IDs, running their names through the system. The process took longer than necessary, and Michael could feel the tension rising in the air. His heart raced, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he knew how quickly things could escalate in situations like this. After what felt like an eternity, the officers finally let them go, but not without a parting warning. "Stay out of trouble," one of them said, his tone filled with disdain. "You never know when we might catch you doing something you shouldn't." Michael walked away, his body tense with frustration. This wasn't the first time he had been stopped by the police, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. It didn't matter how talented he was, how hard he worked, or how clean his record was. To the world, he was still just another black kid from the projects. Despite the rising tensions and the increasing pressure, Michael never let it affect his performance on the court. If anything, the adversity fueled him, pushing him to work even harder. But the cost of his success was beginning to weigh on him. His relationships with his family and friends were strained, and his body was constantly aching from the grueling training regimen he had imposed on himself. There were days when he wondered if it was all worth it. The fame, the recognition, the promise of a future in the NBA. It all seemed so distant, so fragile. And no matter how far he came, the world kept reminding him of his place, of the limits imposed on him by society. Yet every time he thought about giving up, he remembered his mother's tired face, the way she held her back after a long day of work, and the sound of his siblings laughing in the next room. He couldn't stop now. Not when he was so close. Michael's life was a constant balancing act, and though he was rising to fame, the pressures of racism, family struggles, and law enforcement harassment were never far behind. But the breaking point would come soon, and one night, a simple act would lead to a confrontation that could change everything. As Michael's success grew, so did the weight of the world around him. His journey to becoming a basketball star wasn't just about perfecting his game anymore. It was about survival. Every step he took toward his dream seemed to be met with challenges that had nothing to do with his talent and everything to do with the color of his skin. The further he pushed himself to the top, the more he felt the oppressive weight of racism that followed him wherever he went. It was as though society, while acknowledging his potential, simultaneously tried to keep him in his place. Michael's college experience was far from the typical student-athlete's story. While his performances on the basketball court earned him admiration from fans and his teammates, his experience off the court was often marred by subtle and sometimes blatant discrimination. The university prided itself on its diversity, but the reality was much different. Michael and his black teammates often felt like outsiders in a world that catered to wealthy, white students. His team, mostly composed of black players from similar backgrounds as Michael, was viewed with suspicion by many. When they walked through the halls of the university, conversations would fall silent. The wealthy students with their expensive clothes and polished appearances looked at them as though they didn't belong. There was an unspoken understanding that Michael and his teammates were there for one reason, and one reason only: to entertain the crowd on game days. The subtle racism they encountered was perhaps even more painful than the outright hostility they faced in other situations. Professors treated them differently, assuming that because they were athletes they weren't serious about their studies. It didn't matter how much effort Michael put into his academic work. He was constantly underestimated. When he asked questions in class, the professors would answer curtly, as though he were wasting their time. But it wasn't just the academic setting where Michael felt the sting of discrimination. Outside the classroom, in the broader university social scene, things were even worse. The fraternities and sororities that dominated campus life were overwhelmingly white, and they made little effort to hide their disdain for the black athletes who received scholarships. Michael overheard conversations that made his blood boil, students talking about how unfair it was that kids from the ghetto were getting opportunities that should have gone to real students. At parties, he and his teammates were rarely invited, and on the rare occasions when they were, the atmosphere was uncomfortable. They were often the only black people in the room, and it was clear that they were there as tokens rather than equals. The looks they received, furtive, judgmental, told them everything they needed to know. Michael could feel the eyes on him, as if his every move was being scrutinized, waiting for him to slip up, so that the whispers and judgments could begin. As Michael's popularity on the court grew, so did the attention on his personal life. It seemed like every aspect of his existence was now up for public consumption. He was no longer just a talented basketball player. He was the black kid from the projects, and everything he did was viewed through that lens. The media, while celebrating his talent, couldn't resist painting a narrative of hardship and struggle. They fixated on his upbringing in a poor, crime-ridden neighborhood, often framing his story as one of a ghetto boy trying to escape his surroundings. While Michael was proud of where he came from and the resilience it had instilled in him, he resented the way his story was being twisted to fit a stereotype. He wasn't just a kid who had come from nothing. He was a driven, hard-working athlete who had fought for every inch of success. But the world seemed more interested in sensationalizing his background than in recognizing his skills. The online attention he received was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, his social media presence helped him gain recognition from scouts and fans alike. Clips of his best plays went viral, and his follower count grew by the thousands every day. But with the praise came the hate. Comment sections were filled with racial slurs, accusations that he was only getting attention because of his background, and claims that he was just another thug with a basketball. No matter how hard he tried to ignore it, the hatred seeped into his consciousness. It was one thing to face racism in person, but seeing it splashed across the internet for all to see was a different kind of pain. The anonymity of the internet seemed to embolden people, allowing them to spew venomous words without consequence. Michael often found himself scrolling through the comments late at night, reading the hateful words until his stomach churned with anger. He had worked so hard to be seen as more than just a product of his environment. Yet it seemed that no matter what he did, the world refused to let him escape that box. He was either an inspiration for making it out of the ghetto, or a future failure destined to fall back into it. There was no middle ground, no recognition of the complex, multidimensional person that he was. The racism that Michael faced wasn't limited to the classroom or the internet. In the streets, the police were a constant reminder that, in the eyes of the law, he was always a suspect. Growing up, Michael had learned to navigate the dangers of the streets, but nothing could prepare him for the frequent harassment he and his teammates faced from law enforcement. Police cars patrolled the area around the university constantly, and it seemed like every time Michael and his friends left the gym after a late practice, they were stopped and questioned. The officers never seemed to believe that a group of black men walking together could possibly be students. They were treated as criminals, with the same questions asked every time. What are you doing here? Do you have any ID? Have you been drinking? You know there's been trouble around here lately, right? It didn't matter how many times Michael explained that they were student athletes, that they were heading back to campus after practice. The officers would always take their time, running their IDs, searching them, and treating them like they were guilty of something. One night, as they walked back from a particularly exhausting practice, the harassment escalated. A police cruiser pulled up alongside them, its lights flashing red and blue against the dark sky. Two officers stepped out, their hands resting on their holsters as they approached. "Hey, what are you boys doing out here this late?" one of the officers asked, his tone condescending. Michael, as always, was the first to speak. "We just finished practice, officer. We're heading back to the dorms." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Practice this late? Doesn't seem likely. You sure you're not out here causing trouble?" Michael clenched his jaw, trying to stay calm. "No, sir. We're just walking back. We're athletes. We're on the basketball team." The other officer smirked. "Basketball team, huh? Well, we've had a lot of break-ins in the area recently, and you boys look like you might fit the description." Michael could feel his heart racing. He had heard this line before. It was the same story every time. Some vague crime had supposedly happened nearby, and they just happened to fit the description. "We're not involved in anything like that," Michael said, his voice steady but tense. "We're just trying to get home." But the officers weren't satisfied. They demanded to see their IDs, and after checking them, one of the officers began to frisk them. It wasn't the first time Michael had been patted down for no reason, but it didn't make it any easier. Each time it happened, he felt the humiliation of being treated like a criminal, simply for existing in a space where people didn't think he belonged. The officers finally let them go, but not without a final warning. "Watch yourselves," one of them said as they walked away. "You never know when we might catch you doing something you shouldn't." Michael kept walking, his fists clenched at his sides. The injustice of it all was suffocating. It didn't matter how good of a player he was, how hard he worked, or how much he achieved. To the police, he would always be just another black kid in the wrong place at the wrong time. Michael wasn't the only one in his family dealing with racism. His mother, despite working herself to the bone at multiple jobs, was constantly treated as less than by her employers. She had worked as a cleaner in wealthy homes and businesses for years, and no matter how diligent she was always spoken to with condescension. "They think I'm invisible," she once told Michael, her voice heavy with exhaustion, "like I'm not even a person, just someone to clean up after them." Michael's younger siblings, too, faced their own struggles. Jordan, who had once idolized Michael and dreamed of following in his footsteps, had started to withdraw. He had become quieter, more withdrawn, as the pressure of living up to Michael's success weighed on him. Layla and Destiny, still in middle school, were often teased and bullied for their clothes and for living in the ghetto. The weight of it all, the racism, the harassment, the expectations, pressed down on Michael like an invisible force. He had to succeed, not just for himself, but for his family. They were counting on him to make it, to prove that they were more than the sum of the stereotypes society had placed on them. Michael's encounters with racism and injustice were becoming increasingly personal, but the breaking point was yet to come. One night, a simple task would escalate into a life-altering confrontation, showing him just how fragile his success truly was. The weight of the day had settled heavily on Michael's shoulders as he walked back home from another grueling training session. It was late, well after midnight, and the streets of the neighborhood were eerily quiet. The usual sounds of the city, distant sirens, the hum of cars, occasional bursts of shouting, were absent, leaving only the faint rustling of leaves in the night breeze. The air was cool, and Michael pulled his hoodie tighter around himself as he neared the small apartment complex where he and his family lived. Exhaustion gnawed at him, both physical and mental. His body ached from the endless drills and scrimmages, his muscles sore and strained from pushing himself to the limit. But it wasn't just the fatigue from training that weighed him down. The constant tension, the burden of knowing that no matter how hard he worked, the world outside would always see him as less, gnawed at his spirit. Racism was a shadow that followed him everywhere, on the court, in the classroom, in the streets, and tonight that shadow felt especially heavy. As he approached the front of the building, he remembered that his mother had asked him to take out the trash. Normally, his younger brother, Jordan, would have handled it, but lately, Jordan had been struggling with school and his own frustrations, so Michael had promised to pick up the slack. It was a small thing, but in a family where everyone was working so hard to survive, even the smallest acts of help meant something. Michael grabbed the trash bag from the kitchen, trying to be as quiet as possible so as not to wake his siblings, who were fast asleep. His mother's tired form was slumped on the couch, her day having long since taken its toll. He looked at her for a moment, her face peaceful in sleep, and felt a pang of sadness. She worked harder than anyone he knew, and yet life had given her so little in return. He couldn't wait for the day when he could tell her she didn't have to work anymore, that she could finally rest. He slipped out of the apartment and headed to the alley behind the building where the dumpsters were located. The air was thick with the smell of old garbage, but Michael was used to it. He threw the bag into the bin, the loud clang of the lid breaking the night's silence. As he turned to head back inside, he noticed the beams of headlights cutting through the darkness. A car slowly rolled down the narrow street, its engine humming softly. Michael didn't think much of it at first. This was, after all, a neighborhood where people were always coming and going at odd hours. But as the car drew closer, he saw the familiar blue and red lights flash for a moment before the cruiser came to a stop just across the street. His heart sank. He knew what this meant. The police car idled for a moment, its lights off, as if the officers inside were sizing him up. Then the driver's side door opened, and a tall, stocky white officer stepped out, his hand resting casually on the holster of his gun. "Hey," the officer called out, his voice sharp in the quiet night. "What are you doing out here?" Michael felt a knot form in his stomach. He had been through this routine before, countless times, but something about the way the officer was staring at him made his skin crawl. There was an edge to his voice, an accusation already forming before Michael had even said a word. "I'm just taking out the trash," Michael said, trying to keep his voice steady. His hands stayed at his sides, open and visible, just like his mother had always taught him. "I live here." The officer's gaze narrowed, clearly not satisfied with that explanation. He stepped closer, his hand still on his holster, his posture tense. "You know there's been a lot of trouble around here lately," the officer said, his voice dripping with suspicion. "A lot of break-ins, a lot of gang activity. I don't know anything about that," Michael replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just a student. I'm on the basketball team at the university." The officer snorted, clearly unimpressed. "Yeah, I've heard that one before. You fit the description of someone we're looking for. Tall, black, wearing a hoodie. Same as the guy we're after." Michael's heart raced, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He could feel the situation spiraling out of control. He had done nothing wrong. He was just taking out the trash, but he knew that logic wouldn't matter here. Not when this officer had already decided he was guilty of something. "I'm not the guy you're looking for," Michael said, trying to stay calm. "I haven't done anything wrong." But the officer wasn't listening. He stepped even closer, now just a few feet away, his hand inching toward his gun. Michael could see the tension in his posture, the barely concealed aggression in his eyes. He had heard enough stories, seen enough videos, to know what could happen next. "Turn around," the officer ordered, his voice suddenly cold and authoritative. "Hands behind your head. I'm not gonna ask again." Michael froze. His mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare, but there was none. He could feel the panic rising in his chest, threatening to choke him. If he moved too fast, if he reached for his phone, if he made one wrong move, this could be it. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "Stay calm. Don't give them a reason." "Please," Michael said, his voice cracking with fear. "I'm just trying to get back inside. I haven't done anything." The officer's face twisted in anger. He pulled his gun from its holster and pointed it directly at Michael's chest. "Get on the ground, now!" the officer shouted, his voice shaking with a mix of authority and fear. The sound of the gun being drawn made the moment terrifyingly real. The cold metal of the barrel was like a death sentence waiting to be executed. Michael's mind screamed at him to run, to flee, to escape this horrific scene, but his body wouldn't move. He dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as he raised them above his head. The gravel on the pavement bit into his skin, and he could hear the rapid thumping of his own heartbeat in his ears. The officer stepped forward, still aiming the gun at Michael's chest, his finger hovering over the trigger. In the distance, the door of the apartment building creaked open. Michael's mother, hearing the commotion, stepped out into the alleyway. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene before her son, on his knees, with a gun pointed at him by a police officer. "Please," she cried out, rushing toward them. Tears streamed down her face as she ran to Michael's side. "Please don't shoot him. He didn't do anything. He's my son. He's not a criminal." The officer hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting between Michael and his mother. His gun remained trained on Michael, but there was a flicker of doubt in his expression now. The presence of a witness, especially a desperate, pleading mother, seemed to give him pause. Michael's mother dropped to her knees beside him, wrapping her arms around him protectively, as if trying to shield him from the officer's wrath. "Please," she sobbed. "He's a good boy. He's not in a gang. He's just trying to take out the trash. Please let him go." The officer's grip on his gun loosened slightly, but his eyes still burned with suspicion. He was angry, Michael could tell, angry that the situation hadn't gone the way he expected, that his authority was being challenged. But he didn't lower the weapon. "You need to back up, ma'am," the officer said, his voice still firm but less aggressive now. "This is a police matter." Michael's mother didn't move. "No," she said through her tears. "This is my son." For a long, agonizing moment, everything hung in the balance. Michael's breath was shallow, his heart pounding as he waited for the officer's next move. He could feel his mother trembling beside him, her arms still around him, her body shielding him from harm. Finally, with a low growl of frustration, the officer holstered his gun. "You're lucky," he muttered, stepping back, "but I'll be watching you." With that, the officer turned and walked back to his patrol car. The door slammed shut, and the engine roared to life as the car sped away into the night, its red and blue lights flashing as it disappeared down the street. Michael stayed on his knees for a moment, too stunned to move. His mother was still holding him tightly, her sobs echoing in the quiet alley. The fear, the humiliation, the helplessness, it all crashed down on him at once, and for the first time in a long time, Michael felt like a child again. He had never been so close to losing everything. Michael and his mother sat in the alley for what felt like hours, though it was only minutes. Slowly, his mother helped him to his feet, her hands shaking as she wiped away her tears. "Let's go inside," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "It's over now." But Michael knew it wasn't over. Not really. This was the reality he and his family had to live with. The constant fear of being targeted, of being seen as guilty without cause. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how successful he became, the world would always see him as a threat. As they walked back into the apartment, Michael felt the weight of everything crashing down on him. His dreams of the NBA, his desire to provide for his family, his hope that he could rise above the circumstances of his life. It all seemed so fragile now. One wrong move, one misunderstanding, and everything he had worked for could be taken away in an instant. His mother squeezed his hand as they stepped inside, her face lined with exhaustion and worry. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "No matter what happens, I'm proud of you." Michael nodded, but the words felt hollow. Pride wasn't enough. He needed change. He needed justice. And most of all, he needed a future where nights like this didn't happen anymore. The incident in the alley left Michael shaken, but it also ignited something inside him, a deeper resolve to succeed, not just for his family, but for all the young black men like him who faced the same injustices. But as the world began to take notice of his story, Michael would soon learn that the battle was far from over. The early hours of the morning were unusually still, as Michael sat on the edge of his bed, his mind replaying the events from the previous night like a looped video. The cold, unblinking gaze of the officer, the weight of the gun aimed at him, his mother's tears, all of it clung to him, refusing to fade. The house was quiet, but the silence felt heavy, like a pressure pushing down on his chest. His mother was still asleep on the couch, her body curled up in a way that made her look fragile and small, a stark contrast to the fierce strength she had shown when she faced the officer. He could still feel the trembling in her hands as she wrapped her arms around him, protecting him in a way only a mother could. But even that protection had its limits. Last night, they had come terrifyingly close to those limits, and the reality of it was sinking in, harder and deeper than before. No matter how much he achieved, how far he climbed, the weight of his skin color was something he could never outrun. As the morning sun slowly peeked through the cracks in the window blinds, Michael knew he couldn't stay in bed. His body ached from the emotional and physical toll, but he couldn't let it hold him back. Training would start soon, and if there was one thing he had learned in all his years of struggle, it was that the grind never stopped. Not for him, not for anyone in his position. He quietly dressed in his workout clothes and grabbed his basketball shoes, careful not to wake his siblings or his mother. They had already been through enough. The last thing they needed was another reminder of how precarious their lives were. As he opened the front door, the chill of the morning air hit his face, but it did little to cool the heat that still burned in his chest, the anger, the frustration, and the helplessness. As he stepped outside, his eyes caught sight of the alleyway, the spot where everything had unfolded the night before. He stood there for a moment, staring at the dark corner where the police car had sat, his mind racing through what could have happened. It could have been so much worse. That thought gnawed at him, refusing to let go. Inside the apartment, Michael's mother, Mrs. Carter, slowly stirred awake. Her eyes were swollen from the tears she had shed, and her body felt heavy with the weight of what had happened. She had faced many struggles in her life, raising 4 children alone after her husband left, working long hours in menial jobs that barely paid the bills. But nothing had ever scared her as much as seeing her son on his knees with a gun pointed at him. She had always known that her children, especially her boys, would face challenges that went beyond the normal hardships of growing up. As a black mother, she had prepared herself for the day her sons would encounter the harsh reality of racism in the world. But no amount of preparation could have readied her for the sight of her eldest son in such a vulnerable, dangerous situation. As she sat up, pulling the thin blanket around her shoulders, the memories of the night before flooded back, and with them came a fresh wave of tears. She had been strong in that moment, holding it together for Michael, but now, in the quiet stillness of the morning, her composure cracked. Her son had almost been taken from her, not by illness or accident, but by a system that was supposed to protect him. The irony of it was too much to bear. The sound of the front door closing brought her back to the present. She wiped her eyes quickly, hoping none of the other children had seen her crying. She had to be strong for them. She always had to be strong. But as she walked into the kitchen to start the coffee, she couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that had settled deep in her bones. Michael was out there again, training, pushing himself harder than anyone she had ever known. She admired him for it, but it also scared her. The world outside was cruel, and no matter how hard Michael worked, no matter how talented he was, she knew that to many, he was still just another black kid from the projects. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't right, but it was the reality they lived in, and after last night, that reality felt closer than ever. She poured herself a cup of coffee, her hands shaking slightly as she set the mug on the kitchen table. What could she do? She had spent years raising her children to be kind, respectful, hard-working, everything society demanded of them. But it never seemed to be enough. The world had already made up its mind about them before they even had a chance to prove themselves. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the neighborhood began to stir. People left for work, kids headed to school, and the usual hum of life returned to the streets. But there was an undercurrent of tension in the air. The events of the previous night had not gone unnoticed. Several of the neighbors had witnessed what had happened in the alley. From their windows and front porches, they had watched as the police officer drew his gun on Michael, his mother's desperate pleas filling the air. Some had filmed the incident on their phones, and by morning, those videos were circulating around the neighborhood and beyond. The community was no stranger to police harassment. Many of the residents, especially the young black men, had their own stories of being stopped, questioned, or worse. But seeing someone like Michael, someone who was on the brink of achieving something great, go through that, it struck a nerve. For many, Michael represented hope, a symbol that someone from their neighborhood could make it out and become something more. But last night had reminded them all of the harsh reality they faced, no matter how talented or hard-working they were. As the videos spread, people began to talk. In hushed conversations at the corner store, in the halls of the apartment buildings, and on the basketball courts, the question was always the same. How could this happen? How could someone like Michael, who was so close to success, be treated like a criminal for doing something as simple as taking out the trash? Later that afternoon, Mrs. Carter found herself sitting on the worn-out couch, watching the local news. Her hands gripped the armrest tightly as she listened to the latest report. The story had already started to gain traction. "Local basketball star harassed by police" was the headline, scrolling across the screen. They showed a brief clip of the video, the one that had been recorded by a neighbor. In it, you could see Michael on his knees, the police officer's gun trained on him, and Mrs. Carter rushing to his side, her voice cracking with desperation as she begged the officer to let her son go. Seeing it play out on the screen brought the emotions flooding back. Her eyes welled up with tears again, but this time there was something more than just fear in them. There was anger. Mrs. Carter had always believed in the power of perseverance. She had taught her children that if they worked hard, they could overcome anything. But last night had shown her that hard work wasn't enough. No amount of discipline, no level of success could shield them from the racism that was embedded in the very fabric of the world they lived in. And that realization filled her with a burning sense of injustice. She wasn't going to let this go. She couldn't. For too long, people in their community had been silent, accepting the mistreatment as just another part of life. But now, with her son's future hanging in the balance, Mrs. Carter knew she had to do something. She had to make sure that what happened to Michael wouldn't happen again, not to him, not to anyone else. Grabbing her phone, she dialed a number she hadn't used in years. It was the number of an old friend, someone who had connections with local activists and community leaders. If there was anyone who could help, it was him. "Hey, it's me," she said, her voice steady with determination. "We need to talk. Something happened last night, and I need your help." Word spread quickly through the community. What had started as a single incident in a dark alleyway was now becoming something much bigger. People were angry. They were tired of being treated as second-class citizens, of being harassed and mistreated by the very people who were supposed to protect them. And Michael's story, with all its potential and heartbreak, became the spark that ignited the flame. Local activists organized a rally, demanding justice for Michael and others like him. Flyers were posted around the neighborhood, and social media buzzed with messages of support. The local news station picked up the story, interviewing neighbors, former teachers, and even some of Michael's teammates. Everyone had the same thing to say. This wasn't just about one boy. This was about an entire community that had been marginalized and mistreated for far too long. Michael, however, remained quiet. The attention made him uncomfortable. He had never sought out the spotlight for anything other than his basketball skills, and now, with everyone talking about him, he felt exposed in a way he had never experienced before. But deep down, he knew this was bigger than him. It wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about the systemic racism that plagued his entire community. Still, the pressure was mounting. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends, teammates, and reporters looking for a comment. But Michael wasn't ready to speak. Not yet. He needed time to process everything, to understand what had happened and why. Late that night, after the sun had long since set, Michael sat down with his mother. She had just returned from a community meeting, her face flushed with emotion and determination. They sat together in the small kitchen, the light from the single overhead bulb casting long shadows on the walls. "I don't want this to happen to anyone else," Mrs. Carter said, her voice trembling with a mix of exhaustion and conviction. "Not to you, not to your brother, not to anyone." Michael nodded, understanding her pain but feeling the weight of it all settling on his shoulders. He didn't ask for this responsibility, but it was clear that his mother and the community were looking to him now, not just as a basketball player, but as a symbol of something greater. "I know, Mom," he whispered. "I know." Mrs. Carter reached across the table and took his hand in hers, squeezing it tightly. "I'm proud of you, Michael," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "No matter what happens, I'm proud of you." Michael swallowed the lump in his throat, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. He didn't feel like a hero, and he didn't feel like a leader. He was just a boy trying to play basketball, trying to make a life for himself and his family. But the world had other plans for him, and now he had to figure out how to rise to the occasion. The community was rallying around Michael, and the calls for justice were growing louder. But the world of sports wasn't immune to the pressures of society, and as the spotlight on him grew brighter, Michael would soon face a crossroads between his dreams and the responsibility he never asked for. The streets outside the Carter household were alive with an energy that hadn't been felt in years. Michael stood by the window of his cramped apartment, looking out at the growing crowd that had gathered just beyond the front steps. The sounds of voices, megaphones, and chanting filled the air, echoing down the block. Signs with messages of justice for Michael and end police brutality were held high by community members, activists, and even some of his teammates from the university. The rally, once a small gathering, had swelled into something much larger. It should have been a source of strength for Michael. His entire life had been about overcoming adversity, about pushing himself to be better, stronger, faster. But as he stood there, watching the movement that had built around him, he felt an overwhelming sense of uncertainty. This wasn't about basketball anymore. It wasn't even about him as an individual. This was about something much bigger, something deeper, an entire community's struggle for justice and recognition. Michael's mother, Mrs. Carter, had been tireless over the past few days, working with local organizers and activists to make sure their voices were heard. After that fateful night, when Michael was nearly arrested for doing nothing more than taking out the trash, Mrs. Carter had made it her mission to fight back. Her involvement had brought even more attention to the story, and now the media was camped outside their building, hoping to catch a glimpse of Michael or get a statement from his family. But the attention was beginning to take its toll on Michael. He had never wanted to be the face of a movement. All he had ever wanted was to play basketball, to provide for his family, and to escape the cycle of poverty and violence that had plagued his neighborhood for as long as he could remember. Now, it seemed as though the weight of the world had been placed on his shoulders, and he wasn't sure how to carry it. The phone had been ringing non-stop since the video of Michael's confrontation with the police went viral. News outlets wanted interviews. Talk shows wanted to feature him. Reporters camped outside his apartment, hoping to catch a glimpse of the young man whose story had ignited the latest conversation about race and police brutality in America. At first, Michael had been hesitant to speak to anyone. He didn't know what to say, and frankly, he wasn't sure if anything he said would make a difference. He was just one person, after all. What could he possibly do to change a system that had been in place for generations? But as the days passed and the calls grew more frequent, Michael began to realize that he couldn't stay silent forever. His mother had been pushing him to speak up, to use this moment to not only tell his story, but to advocate for the many others like him who didn't have a platform. "They need to hear from you, Michael," she said one night, as they sat together in the living room. The room was dimly lit, casting long shadows on the worn-out furniture. "You have a voice now. You can help make sure this doesn't happen to someone else." Michael knew she was right, but the thought of stepping into the spotlight in that way terrified him. He'd always let his game do the talking. He had spent his entire life working to be recognized for his skills on the court, not for the color of his skin or the injustices he had faced. But now, those two worlds had collided, and there was no separating them. Still, the media attention was relentless. Every channel seemed to be talking about him, debating his story, and dissecting every detail of his life. They talked about his childhood in the projects, about his rise as a promising basketball star, and about the incident with the police. Some outlets praised him for his resilience, while others questioned the validity of his story, subtly implying that he might have done something to provoke the officer. The scrutiny was suffocating. As the media frenzy grew, so did the pressure from the university. What had once been a supportive environment for Michael and his basketball career now seemed to shift into something more complicated. The administration, worried about their reputation and the growing controversy surrounding Michael's story, began to make moves to distance themselves from the situation. There were whispers among the staff and faculty about how the university didn't want to be involved in a political controversy. Though no one said it directly to Michael's face, he could sense the shift in attitude from the school's leadership. Emails from the administration became more formal, and requests for meetings with the basketball team's coaches hinted at concerns about how Michael's situation might affect the team's image. His coach, who had always been a mentor to Michael, tried to reassure him. "Just focus on your game," Coach Davis said one afternoon after practice. "Don't let all this outside noise distract you. We're here to play basketball, not get involved in politics." But Michael knew it wasn't that simple. How could he separate the two when his very existence as a black man in America was being politicized? He couldn't just ignore what had happened. He couldn't pretend that the world outside the court didn't exist. The tension was growing, and Michael felt it in every interaction he had with the university staff. They didn't say it outright, but the message was clear. They wanted him to focus on basketball and let the controversy die down. But how could he, when every time he walked into the gym, the weight of what had happened hung over him like a dark cloud? Social media was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it was the platform that had brought attention to his story. Without the video that had gone viral, Michael's experience with the police might have gone unnoticed. Just another instance of racial profiling swept under the rug. But now, millions of people across the country, and even the world, knew his name. They knew his story, and they were demanding justice. His Instagram and Twitter accounts had blown up overnight, gaining thousands of new followers every day. People from all walks of life reached out to him, offering support, sharing their own stories of discrimination, and calling for action. But mixed in with the messages of solidarity were the inevitable voices of hate. Trolls flooded his inbox with racial slurs, accusations, and threats. Some claimed that he was making the whole thing up for attention, that he was just trying to play the victim card to gain sympathy. Others went even further, sending him violent threats that made his skin crawl. "You should have been shot," one message read. "The world would be better off without thugs like you." Michael tried to ignore the hate, but it was hard. The negativity seemed to seep into every corner of his life, turning what should have been a moment of triumph, his rise as a basketball star, into a nightmare of fear and anxiety. But even through the darkness, there was light. Messages from fans, from activists, from people who believed in him and wanted to see him succeed. They urged him to keep going, to not let the hate win. And slowly, Michael began to realize that his story had become something bigger than himself. People were rallying around him because they saw him as a symbol of something much larger: hope for change, hope for justice. One evening, As the chaos of the day finally quieted down, Michael found himself sitting alone in the living room, staring at his phone. A notification had popped up on the screen. A direct message from an NBA player he admired, offering support and encouragement. The message was simple, but it hit Michael hard. "Keep your head up, man. You're not alone in this. We're all rooting for you." Michael had always dreamed of playing in the NBA. It was the goal he had worked toward his entire life. But now, as that dream came closer to becoming a reality, he realized that he was standing at a crossroads. The path ahead wasn't as clear as it once had been. On one side there was basketball, his passion, his future. He could continue to focus on the game, keep his head down, and hope that the controversy surrounding him would eventually fade. Maybe then, things could go back to normal, and he could chase his dream of making it to the NBA without the weight of everything else holding him back. But on the other side, there was the growing movement around him, the calls for justice, the voices demanding change. They were becoming impossible to ignore. He had a platform now, a voice that people were listening to. He could use that voice to speak out, to fight for something bigger than himself. But doing so would come with risks. It would mean stepping into the spotlight in a way he had never intended, and it could potentially jeopardize his basketball career. The weight of that decision pressed down on him, suffocating in its intensity. He didn't ask for any of this, but now it was his reality. Could he continue to pursue his dream while also being a voice for change? Or would he have to choose between the two? Just as Michael's thoughts began to spiral, his mother entered the room. She had been at yet another community meeting, her face lined with exhaustion but also a quiet determination. She sat down beside him, her presence calming in the midst of the storm. "You're thinking too much," she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. Michael sighed, leaning back against the couch. "I don't know what to do, Mom. I don't know how to handle all of this." His mother looked at him with the same steady gaze she had always given him, the one that let him know she believed in him, no matter what. "You've always known what to do," she said. "You've never let anything stop you before. This is no different." "But it's not just about basketball anymore," Michael said, his voice thick with frustration. "It's about everything else. The police, the media, the university. It's all too much." His mother smiled gently, her eyes filled with understanding. "You're right. It's more than just basketball, but you're more than just a basketball player. You've always been more. You have a voice now, and people are listening. That's a gift, Michael. Don't waste it." Michael stared at the floor, her words sinking in. He knew she was right. As much as he wanted to just focus on basketball, as much as he wanted to keep his head down and ignore everything else, he couldn't. The world wasn't going to let him, and deep down, he didn't want to either. "I just don't want to lose everything I've worked for," he admitted quietly. "You won't," his mother said firmly. "You've worked too hard, and you've come too far. This is just another challenge, and I know you can handle it." Michael nodded slowly, her words giving him strength. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in days, he felt a sense of clarity. He didn't have to choose between his dream and his responsibility. He could be both, a basketball player and an advocate for justice. He could use his platform to make a difference, to fight for the people who had always believed in him, and to stand up for those who didn't have a voice. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be without risk. But if there was one thing Michael had learned in his life, it was that nothing worth having came without a fight. As he sat there, with his mother beside him, Michael made a decision. He wasn't going to run from this. He wasn't going to stay silent. He was going to use this moment, this platform, to speak out, to fight for justice, and to show the world that he was more than just another statistic. Michael's decision to embrace his role as both an athlete and an advocate for justice marks a turning point in his journey. His story will inspire others to stand up against injustice. And though the road ahead will be difficult, Michael is ready to face it head-on, knowing that his success isn't just for him, but for everyone who believes in the fight for equality. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. If you liked this video, be sure to check out the others on our channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Click on the next videos and stay tuned. There's more to come.